In 73 BC, Rome seemed almost untouchable. The Republic dominated the Mediterranean. Its armies had conquered kingdoms, crushed rival powers, and brought enormous wealth back to Italy. But beneath all that power and prosperity was a much darker reality. Millions of enslaved people lived and worked throughout the Roman world. Some were prisoners of war. Others had been born into slavery, sold into it, or condemned to it as punishment. They worked on farms, in mines and workshops, and inside the homes of wealthy Romans. And some were sent to the arena. They were trained to fight, trained to kill, and forced to entertain thousands of spectators while risking their own lives. They were gladiators. Then, in the summer of 73 BC, something changed in Capua. A small group of gladiators decided they had nothing left to lose. Fewer than 100 men escaped from their training school, seized whatever weapons they could find, and fled into the countryside. At first, Rome barely noticed. That would not last long. What began as a desperate escape quickly became something far more dangerous. More slaves joined the fugitives, and their numbers grew rapidly. Before long, what had started as a handful of gladiators had become a massive rebellion, forcing Rome to send increasingly powerful forces to crush it. At the center of it all was a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus. Rome had trained him to fight for the entertainment of others. Instead, he would become the leader of an army that would challenge the power of Rome itself. It soon became clear that Rome could no longer ignore the growing threat. In response, the Senate sent the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber with a force of perhaps 3,000 men, largely militia and local troops, to track down and put an end to Spartacus's rebellion. Spartacus and his followers soon learned that they were being hunted. Rather than confront the Romans in the open, or simply flee, Spartacus chose a more tactical approach. He led his men into the rugged terrain surrounding Mount Vesuvius, where he could take advantage of the steep slopes and wait for Glaber's army to come to him. Glaber pursued the rebels without much hesitation. Determined to crush the rebellion and earn glory and political prestige, he appears to have underestimated the danger he faced. Whether he believed his larger force would be enough to overwhelm the rebels, or simply dismissed a band of escaped slaves as a serious military threat, his failure to prepare for the terrain and the enemy's tactics would prove to be a major mistake. Spartacus and his men took up a position on the heights of Vesuvius. With the steep terrain protecting their flanks and rear, they occupied a naturally strong defensive position, making a direct assault extremely difficult. The rebels were poorly equipped. Most carried weapons and shields they had looted or improvised, while only a handful possessed decent armor. Many had little more than simple clothing to protect them. Yet, despite their lack of equipment, Spartacus's men had one crucial advantage. They had the high ground, and they were fighting for their freedom. Glaber's Roman troops advanced in battle formation. They believed they had the rebels trapped, with nowhere left to escape. It was a foolish assumption. Glaber was not dealing with an ordinary escaped slave. Spartacus was a capable military leader who would repeatedly prove himself several steps ahead of the Roman commanders sent against him. Spartacus used the terrain to his advantage, concealing portions of his force behind the ridges and slopes of Vesuvius, making his army appear smaller than it actually was. Once the Romans were where he wanted them, Spartacus made his move. A sizable portion of his force descended the slopes and crashed into the unsuspecting Roman left flank. The trap had been sprung. Glaber's Roman troops were now being attacked from two directions. Fighting against former slaves who wanted nothing more than their freedom, the Roman soldiers found themselves outmatched by the rebels' determination and ferocity. What had seemed like an easy victory was rapidly turning into a disaster. The battle did not last long. The Roman formation collapsed under the pressure of Spartacus's attack. Men broke ranks and fled as the rebels overwhelmed them, turning the battlefield into a complete rout. Glaber's army had been decisively defeated, and the fate of the praetor himself remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he may have been killed, but the ancient sources do not provide a clear answer. Spartacus's superior strategy had paid off, while the Roman response had failed miserably. The rebellion was no longer a minor disturbance. Rome had just suffered its first major defeat at the hands of Spartacus, and the Senate was about to realize that this was a far more serious threat than it had imagined. Roman authorities were now dealing with something much more dangerous than a band of runaway gladiators. They were dealing with an expanding rebel army. The Senate continued sending Roman commanders against Spartacus, but one after another, these forces were defeated as the rebel army continued to grow. News of Spartacus's victories spread rapidly. More and more escaped gladiators and enslaved people joined his cause, along with others outside the slave population, including shepherds and marginalized people from across the Italian countryside. The original gladiators formed the core of the movement, but they were soon joined by thousands of new recruits. The rebel army may have eventually numbered tens of thousands. Ancient sources give much larger figures, but the exact size of Spartacus's forces remains impossible to establish with certainty. Spartacus sent his commanders throughout the countryside to gather more recruits and supplies. Rebel forces raided Roman estates, disrupted local commerce, and seized food and resources needed to sustain the growing army. The rebellion was growing stronger, but so were the divisions within it. Among the most important groups within the rebellion were Gauls and Germans. These men brought their own military traditions, loyalties, and leadership structures with them. And this would eventually create one of Spartacus's greatest problems. The rebel army was not a modern, centralized military. It was a coalition. Its members did not necessarily share the same objectives. One of Spartacus's key military figures was Crixus, a Gallic gladiator who had escaped from Capua alongside him. At some point, Crixus broke away from the main army with a sizable force of Gauls and Germans. The exact reason for this division is uncertain. Crixus and his followers may have wanted to continue raiding Roman territory, seeking wealth and revenge, while Spartacus appears to have pursued a broader strategic objective. Whatever the reason, the split exposed a fundamental weakness within the rebellion. Spartacus and the main body of his followers appear to have wanted to escape Italy altogether, potentially crossing the Alps and leaving Roman territory behind. Their ultimate goal may have been to reach freedom beyond Rome's grasp. The Romans saw an opportunity. With the rebel army divided, the Senate moved quickly. It appointed Lucius Gellius Publicola, one of the consuls of 72 BC, to take command of the campaign against Spartacus and his growing rebellion. Publicola marched south with a large consular army, determined to exploit the division within the rebel ranks and crush the uprising before Spartacus could reunite his forces. For Rome, the strategy was simple: keep the rebels separated, defeat them individually, and end the revolt before it could spread any further. Another Roman commander, Quintus Arrius, was dispatched against Crixus and his followers. The Romans now had an opportunity to destroy one of the two major rebel forces before it could join with Spartacus again. Crixus and his men were eventually cornered near Mount Garganus at the northern end of the Apulian plain. Their position was becoming increasingly desperate as the Romans closed in, cutting off their options and forcing them toward a decisive confrontation. The rebels had fought Roman forces before and had survived against overwhelming odds. But this time, they were isolated from Spartacus and faced a Roman army that had come specifically to destroy them. Then the two forces finally met. The Romans formed their ranks, while Crixus prepared his men for the coming clash. After months of rebellion, flight, and brutal fighting, there was no longer anywhere left to run. Battle was about to be joined. This was no militia or town guard. This was a full-strength Roman consular army. Disciplined legionaries, many of them veterans of previous campaigns, filled the ranks. With shields locked together and formations tightly organized, they advanced steadily toward the rebels in full battle order. For Spartacus's followers, this was an enemy unlike anything they had faced before. The Romans were no longer sending hastily assembled local forces or poorly prepared militia. This was a professional army commanded by one of the Republic's highest-ranking officials. And the situation was about to become even more difficult. Their most experienced strategic commander, Spartacus, was nowhere on the battlefield. Crixus and his men would have to face the full might of Rome without him, which proved to be an impossible task, as Crixus and the vast majority of his army were defeated by Publicola's superior Roman force. Crixus was killed along with a large portion of his followers. Thousands of rebels lay dead across the battlefield, with only a small number managing to escape the slaughter. With Crixus defeated, the Roman Senate turned its full attention towards Spartacus. The death of Crixus was a major blow to the rebellion. Spartacus had lost one of his most important commanders, and his position had suddenly become far more dangerous. Multiple Roman armies were now pursuing him, determined to crush the rebellion once and for all. But Spartacus responded in a way that demonstrated both his military skill and his ruthlessness. After learning of Crixus's defeat, Spartacus moved against the Roman forces. The Romans expected the rebels to be weakened, demoralized, and on the run. They were horribly mistaken. Instead, Spartacus went on the offensive. His army first destroyed a Roman consular force led by Clodianus. Then, turning his attention to the approaching forces of Publicola, Spartacus defeated them as well. The Romans attempted to regroup, gathering their shattered forces and combining their remaining troops into a larger army. The consuls once again gave chase, hoping to finally corner the rebel army. But Spartacus defeated them again, in an engagement near Picenum. These victories demonstrated that Spartacus' reforms was far more than a mere slave gladiator. He had proven himself to be a capable military commander, able to maneuver large forces, exploit Roman weaknesses, and defeat experienced Roman armies in the field. Rome's first major attempts to suppress Spartacus had failed. The rebellion was rapidly becoming a national emergency. The Senate now realized that ordinary provincial commanders were not enough. Rome needed someone with the resources, wealth, political influence, and military authority necessary to bring the war to an end. That man was Marcus Licinius Crassus. One of Rome's wealthiest citizens and an experienced politician and commander, Crassus was given command of the war in 72 BC. Crassus detached 2 legions under his legate, Mummius, ordering them to maneuver behind Spartacus, while explicitly forbidding them from engaging the rebels. Mummius disobeyed. When an opportunity presented itself, he attacked Spartacus's forces, but the gamble ended disastrously. The Romans were routed. Crassus was furious. Determined to prevent further disobedience and cowardice, he reportedly revived the brutal Roman punishment known as decimation, after some of his soldiers fled from battle. Crassus wanted his soldiers to understand that failure would carry a terrible price. And Crassus pursued Spartacus south into Bruttium. Spartacus may have intended to cross the Strait of Messina into Sicily, where 2 major slave revolts had erupted during the previous century. Reaching the island could have provided fresh recruits and reignited rebellion. According to ancient sources, Spartacus sought ships from Cilician pirates who promised to help him cross. Instead, they took his payment and abandoned him. Spartacus was now stranded in southern Italy, and Crassus had him where he wanted him. Crassus adopted a more systematic strategy. Rather than chasing Spartacus from battlefield to battlefield, he sought to trap the rebels in southern Italy. His soldiers constructed an enormous fortified barrier, a ditch and earthen rampart reinforced with timber, stretching across the peninsula. The goal was to cut off Spartacus's escape routes, isolate his army, and starve it of supplies. Spartacus refused to wait. His forces repeatedly attacked the Roman defenses, searching for a weakness, but the fortifications held. Then winter arrived. A rare weather occurrence in southern Italy followed with heavy snow, and harsh conditions made movement difficult. But Spartacus saw an opportunity. Under cover of darkness, his men filled sections of the ditch with earth, timber, and other materials, creating a passage through the Roman lines. Against all odds, Spartacus and much of his army broke through the blockade and escaped. But not everyone made it out. A substantial rebel force remained behind, under Gannicus the Celt and Castus the Gaul. Why they were left behind is uncertain. They may have been cut off during the breakout, or Spartacus may have deliberately left them as a rearguard or diversion. Whatever the reason, Crassus did not immediately pursue Spartacus. Instead, he turned against the isolated rebel force. The rebellion had split once again, and Crassus was determined to destroy the remaining rebels before they could reunite with Spartacus. The cunning Crassus wasted no time. He sent a small Roman vanguard to locate the rebels and prevent their escape. The Romans numbered only a few thousand, but they soon found themselves facing a rebel army many times their size. Despite the overwhelming odds, neither side hesitated. The two forces closed and crashed into battle. For Crassus, this was the confrontation he had been waiting for. The vanguard sent by Crassus was severely outnumbered. If reinforcements did not arrive soon, the Roman detachment would be overwhelmed and destroyed. Gannicus and Castus wasted no time. Their men fought like cornered animals, throwing themselves against the Roman lines with devastating force. The rebels' overwhelming numerical advantage quickly began to tell. The Roman flanks came under increasing pressure as the rebel forces pushed around both sides of the Roman position, gradually enveloping the beleaguered vanguard. But Crassus was no fool. He had not sent his men forward simply to be slaughtered. The Roman vanguard was serving a purpose. Crassus waited for the perfect moment. Then, he sprang his trap. From the distance, the full might of the Roman army suddenly emerged onto the battlefield. Fresh Roman troops surged forward, rushing toward the rebel army that had become completely absorbed in its assault on the Roman vanguard. Gannicus and Castus had committed their forces too deeply. Their men had surrounded the Roman detachment, but in doing so, they had exposed themselves to the approaching Roman army. With the rebels heavily engaged and their attention focused on destroying the trapped vanguard, they had little time to reorganize their lines or establish a defensive position. The trap had been sprung. The rebels were now caught between the Roman vanguard and Crassus's advancing army. Gannicus and Castus suddenly found themselves in a hopeless predicament. What had begun as an overwhelming rebel assault was rapidly turning into a battle for survival. The rebels fought like cornered beasts, slashing at the Roman ranks with desperate ferocity. But trapped between the Roman vanguard and Crassus's advancing army, their numbers became a liability. With no room to maneuver or escape, they were crushed from all sides. The battle soon became a massacre. Thousands were killed, including the rebel commanders Castus and Gannicus, while the survivors were captured and placed in chains. Now, all attention was focused on Spartacus. In early 71 BC, Spartacus once again moved north, with Crassus pursuing him relentlessly. But a new danger was rapidly approaching. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, was returning to Italy with his army after defeating the remnants of the Sertorian rebellion in Hispania. Crassus knew that if Pompey arrived in time to take part in the final campaign, he could potentially claim the glory for crushing Spartacus and his rebellion. And Pompey was not the only Roman commander on his way. Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus, the Roman commander in Macedonia, was also returning with his forces. The Senate now had an opportunity to bring the 2-year-old rebellion to an end. Rome was taking no chances. With Crassus already commanding a powerful army in Italy, Pompey returning with his veterans from Hispania, and Lucullus bringing additional forces from the east, the Romans were preparing to bring overwhelming strength against Spartacus. The full military might of Rome was now bearing down upon the rebel army. Spartacus understood what this meant. His time was running out. He could no longer afford to remain on the defensive or allow the Roman armies to surround him. If he was going to escape Italy or defeat the Romans, he would have to act quickly. The final phase of the war had begun. The young Thracian-born gladiator chose to give battle on his own terms. Rather than continuing his retreat, Spartacus turned his army around and faced Crassus to the south, hoping to defeat the Roman forces quickly before the other two Roman armies could arrive and overwhelm him. Spartacus's army was exhausted, but it remained dangerous. The rebels knew this was no longer a raid, a retreat, or an attempt to escape. This was the decisive confrontation. Spartacus understood what defeat meant: death or slavery. There would be no second chance. The two armies met in what is believed to be the territory of modern-day Senercia, on the right bank of the Selle River. The precise numbers on either side are unknown, but both armies likely numbered in the tens of thousands. According to the ancient sources, Spartacus reportedly killed his own horse before the battle. The message was clear. If he won, he would have another horse. If he lost, he would have no need for one. It was a symbolic gesture that reflected the grim reality facing the rebel commander. But the ancient sources may have embellished the story over time. What is certain is that Spartacus remained with his army and personally took part in the final battle. The fate of the rebellion, and Spartacus himself, would be decided on this battlefield. Like a fierce predator charging its prey, the rebel army surged fearlessly into the Roman lines. There was no time for caution. Years of pent-up rage and hatred toward their Roman oppressors had led to this very moment. For the rebels, it was now us against them, no matter the outcome. This would be one of the fiercest and most brutal battles of antiquity. Spartacus and his men knew that every moment mattered. If they hesitated, Crassus could reinforce his position while the approaching Roman armies closed in from the north. The rebels had only one option: break through the Romans or die trying. At the center, the rebels, led by Spartacus himself and some of his most experienced gladiator fighters, pressed hard against the Roman line. The assault was ferocious. Wave after wave of rebel warriors crashed into the Roman ranks, cutting through groups of legionaries and forcing gaps into the Roman formation. Spartacus had one objective above all others: reach Crassus. He may have believed that if he could kill the Roman commander, the army would be thrown into confusion. Without its commander, the Roman force might lose cohesion, giving the rebels the opening they desperately needed to break through and escape. But while the rebels were making progress in the center, the situation on the wings was very different. There, Roman cavalry began carving into the more lightly equipped rebel infantry. The mounted Romans used their mobility, long spears, and large shields to keep the rebels pinned down and strike them from positions the infantry struggled to counter. The rebels were poorly equipped to withstand sustained attacks from heavily armed cavalry. The battle was becoming a brutal contrast. At the center, Spartacus and his warriors were forcing their way forward. On the wings, Roman cavalry was steadily hemming the rebels in. And all the while, the approaching Roman forces were closing the trap. Spartacus had only one chance left: break through Crassus's army, or be surrounded and destroyed. But it just wasn't to be. Spartacus was surrounded, overwhelmed, and killed. The exact circumstances remain unknown, and his body was never identified. The man who had terrified Rome vanished beneath the bodies of his followers. With Spartacus dead, the rebellion collapsed. Thousands fled, but Crassus's troops pursued them, killing or capturing large numbers. Crassus then sent a brutal message to Rome's slaves. Around 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Via Appia between Capua and Rome, their crosses reportedly stretching for miles. By 71 BC, the Third Servile War was over. Spartacus was dead, his army destroyed, and thousands had been killed, captured, or crucified. Yet the rebellion had exposed Rome's vulnerabilities. Its enormous slave population, dependence on enslaved labor, and early military failures had allowed a fugitive gladiator to become a genuine threat to the Republic, and, for a time, even threatened to escape Italy. Spartacus had failed, but his name would endure for centuries.